So I went 170. Yeah, I went 170. I never anticipated that I would actually get a chance to drive a race car, but I got to drive a race car. My brother asked me in February if I wanted to do the driver experience. And in my mind, I only thought of the ride-alongs because it seems so absurd and impossible that somebody would allow you to get into a race car and drive it at Daytona International Speedway that I was like, I thought about it, but maybe that would be a more meaningful thing for other people. And then towards the end of the interaction, he mentioned the fact that we might be able to drive.
Anybody. I want to go fast.
And suddenly it became meaningful to me because I've been a sim driver since I was a little kid. My cousin left his computer in our basement back in those days. And so I had access to Doom, which was a very fun game. And I had access to, I think it was NASCAR Racing. And then my parents got a Windows 95 computer and I purchased NASCAR Racing 2 later. And then when I got my own computer in high school, I installed NASCAR Racing 3 on my computer. And what makes NASCAR Racing interesting at the time was that they were an actual driving simulator, where most car racing games were Mario Kart-like in that they were not simulation at all. They were some approximation of driving. You had a steering wheel, you had a car, you had all that kind of stuff. But the physics and everything involved in the actual racing was not racing, right? It's a video game, whereas a simulation is kind of not a game. The thing that was most fun for that game, NASCAR Racing 2 and 3, was going backwards and crashing into people. They had realistic damage and stuff. And so for me as a child, many of my formative experiences playing racing games were at Daytona. I have, no joke, pulled thousands of laps at Daytona, starting when I was 7 years old. And I'm 36 now. And so that is an incredible amount of time. That's almost 30 years of driving this track. And so my brother whispered it or whatever. I thought he kind of was insinuating it. I didn't believe it, but I was like, okay, driving. But I didn't want to believe it. So he told me that we were driving, and I kind of lost the specific memory of him saying that we were driving, and I wasn't exactly sure that we were driving. So I didn't want to believe that we were driving if we weren't going to end up driving. There's nothing worse to me than the false belief that I'm going to get into a race car and drive it. So I thought, okay, maybe there's a chance that we'll drive it. Even like a week beforehand, when my family members, I'd gone on a family reunion, when I mentioned the trip to my family members at that reunion, I was like, I think we're driving. Because I couldn't let myself really feel the anticipation. But the Wednesday before we went out there, we flew into Daytona, and then it became real because I got a chance to talk to my brother about it, and it was like, yeah, we're driving and we're doing that kind of stuff. And it was actually really stressful. The Wednesday before we went racing, I was laying in bed, and it was the first like real fear that I had, because I've been racing in sim, and a lot of people think that your experience in sim is going to make you believe that you're invincible and all that stuff. That's really not my experience. My experience is that when you do something wrong, you can get really screwed up. When it happens to me in a game, it's a reminder of just how dangerous getting into a real race car and going into a real world environment could be. My recent games are Dirt Rally 2 and Gran Turismo franchise, and I've logged thousands and thousands of hours in sims. And so what you find is that you are not perfect. And I am nowhere near what a professional driver would be, because I have the internet, so I have the ability to just bear witness to people that really know how to drive. And so as I'm laying there, I'm like, what am I about to do? I'm about to get into a race car and drive it. And so it took me a little bit to fall asleep that night. Thursday, it was me and my brother and my brother-in-law and my dad, and we went to Daytona Beach, and we enjoyed that day.
And it's cold. Wesco Gusco.
Friday was the drive day. The driver experience is really cool. You actually get to drive your car into the infield at Daytona Speedway there. And so we had to go through T4, the turn 4 entrance. So you drive through a tube underneath the actual raceway and then pop out. You went through the subway on the interior of the raceway. Not to use raceway too many times. But then we park in a parking lot. We go over to pit lane. And they had 2 queues, one for riders and one for drivers. And we got our passes, and they give you a training. And so we hit up the training, and they're very specific about what you're going to do when you drive. So when you're driving, you are limited to a speed because this is a safe experience. So they're really trying to make sure that you stay under 5,000 RPM, and you're supposed to go 150 miles an hour when you're at 5,000 RPM. They start you out at about 4,000 RPM when you're going out there, and they have a radio controlled rev limiter that stops you. So when you go 4,000 RPM, if you go to 4,100 RPM or you try to cross any of that threshold to over 4,000 RPM, it goes pop, 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 pop. And it'll give you a soft indication that you've pushed too far on the rev. So you have to let off a little bit on your throttle and keep it under that rev limiter. And then they step you up 200 RPM to just under, to 4,200 RPM. If you behave in that, you're allowed, I think, 1 hit on the rev limiter. But if you ride the rev limiter a whole lap, they pull you off because they know that you're not competent enough. The big thing is that there's actually multiple race cars out on the track. And so they're managing traffic. And somebody that's not doing what they're supposed to be doing out there is a danger not only to themselves but the other people that are at the raceway. So they will pull anybody if they see that their behavior is not predictable in some way. So you go through that process from 4,000 to 4,200, 4,400, 4,600, 4,800, and then you go to 5,000. At 5,000 you should be at about 150 miles an hour, which is that's fast.
4 right narrow.
So we go through that, and basically what they have is that they say, listen to your spotter. So there's a guy up in the stands who's watching the whole thing. He's in your ear the entire time, and he's telling you what you should be doing. He can hear the rev limiter pop pretty well, and so he's there to keep you safe. So he's the one that's telling you if other traffic's coming. You got no side mirrors on this car. Those people will tell you where you're supposed to be. But first, so after we got done with that training where they laid out basically what we got to do, we had 2 passes, one for a ride along, so we get to ride along with a professional driver, and then we got a drive section. And we opted to ride along first, whereas the other drivers decided to go drive first. We decided to ride along. As a first experience, it scared the living shit out of me. It scared the shit out of me. You get in the car, you got a fire suit on, and you get your helmet on, you get a Hans device, and then you gotta climb in the window Dukes of Hazzard style.
Frank, 16 minutes. Very good.
We went out there and he revs it up to 160. So when you do the driver experience, 150 is the limit. When you're in the ride-along guys, they can go 160 because they're professional drivers. So they drive it fully at 160 mile an hour, and that shit is scary because he goes out, he's next to the wall on the left side. He takes a racing line. So you're very close to the exterior wall when you're coming down the back straight. And then he pulls it hard in. When you get to the turn, you come up, you go over the bank, it pitches, and then he throws it down towards the apex of that turn. And 160, you have a visceral sense of speed from that passenger seat. And looking out that window, you realize, oh, that is a wall. And that's a real thing. It becomes very real what you're doing, and it really scared the bejeezers out of me. So then basically what I ended up doing is after we get out of that whirlwind, I opted to video my dad. My dad went out. He drove what became my car. I was content to not drive. I pulled my shoulders out of the fire suit and tied it up. I was just ready to shoot some video. what ultimately happened is my dad went out. He did his 16 minutes on 2 trips, and then when he came back,
It was only 150. That's it.
they picked the car based on your body size, and so because my dad had been out in that car and he's about my size, they put me in it.
I'm 5'8". Frank, 16 minutes. Very good.
I'm a little bit taller, so I sit down in this thing. You know, they basically get in your ears immediately. You know. Your spotter's talking to you. Hey, bring it up to 2,200 RPM. Let out the clutch. You know, shift at 3,000. So I take it out, and I immediately notice that I'm shifting at 4,000. And so I shift at 4,000. I go, oh, shoot, I was supposed to shift at 3,000. I didn't think anything of that. And I go out, and he tells me to be at 4,000. I'm about 4,100. He's asking me what my RPMs are, and I let him know where I'm seeing them. But it takes me a lot to see them, because when they strap you into this thing, they really strap you in. So my shoulders were pinned, and you're in a seat that is so form-fitting to you that you cannot move. This is something that's designed to keep you solidly in the same place when you're rotating 16 times in a crash. Car is spinning like a freaking centrifuge. So this thing is really designed to keep you snug. So you know, I was fully tight, so the only movement that I had is in my head and neck, and that's somewhat limited because I got a Hans device. And the steering wheel happened to be right between my vision and the gauge cluster, so I couldn't see I'd have to really crane my neck down to be able to see it. You can, you know, in the video, you see me kind of like peeking down. So he tells me, you know, I go around and he steps me up 4,200 RPM, 4,400 RPM. I think I did a couple of laps before he decided, hey, you know, I think you're right. You're ready to go 5,000. And he said something that was kind of fateful. He didn't tell me to stay at 5,000 RPM. He told me to, he hadn't heard me hit the limiter yet. So he just said, hey, you know, just push down the pedal until you hear that limiter. Neither of us knew what that meant because I didn't hit the limiter. I started hurtling down the back straight. That limiter, little did I know, had fallen out at some point in time. During my dad's time out. When he initially left, I actually have video of him leaving, hitting 3,000 RPM and trying to cross 3,000 RPM. It goes pop, 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 and that's when he shifted. So when I went out and I hit 4,000 RPM, I didn't have a limiter. That thing was supposed to stop me at 3,000 RPM when I was in the pit road. It didn't. So I had full capacity. So I start hurtling down the back straight. I ended up getting into the turn 3. I'm focused on driving at that point because he told me, you know, you'll push it down, you'll hear the rev limiter. So I'm going, man, I don't hear that stupid limiter at all, right? And you know, I didn't feel like I had it completely pinned, but I knew that I had the gas down pretty. far. So I go around that turn, and I'm still like kind of dawdling a little bit, feeling like, oh, okay, where's this limiter, you know? And, you know, I ultimately, well, that first turn, I actually kind of went up a little bit higher than I normally would in the turn. They've got you on a kind of a stupid racing line, which is that they keep you 5 feet from the interior's yellow line. So you're basically on the inside of that track the entire time. You don't go to the right, because if you're 150 mile an hour, the guy would be in the outside position, would have to pull inside of you, and that's not what they want. They want people to stay, you know, in their lanes. The only passing happens on the outside. You do not take a racing line, and normally you don't need it, but as it turned out, I might have needed it. So I go through that one, and my out lap, you know, leaving pits and coming through the first thing, my first full lap was 1:46. It's pretty slow. It's a 2.5 mile track. So 1:46 is not moving that fast. 2.5 minutes is 60 miles an hour. Half of that is about 120. So it's under 120 miles an hour. Anyway, my second lap, I think I did a 1:16. So I did a 1:16 on my second lap. My third lap, I hit 1:02. And this is significant. And I might explain it later. So I hit at 1:02, and then my fourth lap. Now, my fourth lap, I think, is when I realized that I had it to the floor and that I wasn't hitting the limiter. I was somewhat surprised by that, but honestly, I was so focused on what I was doing, I thought maybe that I was just hitting 150, and this is what the limiter keeps you under 150. I wasn't sure what I was thinking. I was just driving at that point. I did a 53.8 second lap on my fourth lap out, and then on my fifth lap, I did. I did a 53.3. And then they say, hey, this is your checkered flag lap. Checkered flag lap in the training. They tell you, okay, you go through turn 1 and turn 2 at full tilt. Then you let off. You transition right up to the skirt. And when your spotter tells you, you can transition over. lines into the skirt area, and then you go at a slow pace through the final turn, and then you do a brake check before you get to pit road. You slow yourself down to like 5-10 mile an hour. Before you get to pit road, you're in neutral, and you just kind of roll in, because the last thing they want is somebody to pull the clutch and run somebody over. So I roll in there, and the guy's saying, hey, good job, you did all right. Right before I get to the end of my thing, I hear the guy go, hey, that guy was 5 seconds, and cuts out right at that second. I'm just sitting there kind of just basking in the moment, just going like, holy cow, I just did that. I just drove. That was fun. The guy that pulled down the grate that keeps your head from going out the window, that checkered thing, and he looks in and he goes, sorry, we pulled you off a little bit early. And I was like, early? I had no perception. They pulled me off a little bit early, right? So he says, yeah, they pulled you off early. You were going a little bit fast. I was like, what? And he goes, yeah, you were 5 seconds faster than the trainers. I was like, what? He's like, yeah, the other vehicles or whatever. And I was like, whoa. And then this guy pops in my window. This guy at the end of the pit road that told me to slow down when I pulled into the pit road. And he pops in my window. And he goes, oh, I think our rev limiter wasn't tripped on. Did you hear it go on or whatever? And I was like, no. And he finds a plug, and he plugs it into the bottom of the MSD. And then he zip ties it in place. And he's like, oh, yeah, that might why you're fast. And there was something in their interaction with me that seemed like had reverence for what I'd just done. And either that or they might have thought that I popped it out. I'm not that smart, but so that sucker fell out of there. I got to use the full car thing. At least that's what I thought. I went back out, and the rev limited NASCAR experience was not as fun. I'll just say that. It was much slower, but it was still like, holy shit, I just did that, holy shit, I just drove that car. It's full muzz, So I pull back in. They did my second 8 minutes, which is just a victory lap for me. Get out of the car, and you can actually see me walking from the car with a pop in my step. I tell my family about it. I tell the lady at the booth thing, and she looked a little bit mad, so she went up and talked to somebody. When we got our print-offs of how fast we went, I somewhat lost some kick in my step, because it said my brother went 147, my dad went 150. They both were rev limited. And then it said I only went 157. And so I was like, oh, okay. Well. And of course, I hadn't seen my ETs. I hadn't seen the time. So it was just one of those things where I was like, oh, okay, well, must have been wrong. So I ultimately realized when I was watching the replay of it and going through and hitting my ETs, when I did the math on it, the 53 seconds that I did at 2.5 miles averaged out to 168.9 miles an hour. And I may have gone over 170 on the straights, because that was the average speed for my lap and doesn't incorporate turns. So I knew it was fast, and that was the greatest moment of my entire life, and that was just truly special. It's hard to convey that. Anyway, thanks for your time.
This right here is Jordan in the 43, red and yellow, and Jason in the 43, blue and white.